suspected that she might have had an intimate relationship with Prince Andrew. She kept coming in and out, in and out. It had about 50 or 60 stuffed toys positioned on the bed, and basically there was a card the inspector showed us. In a shocking twist that's rattled the walls of Buckingham Palace, several of Prince Andrew's former maids have come forward with disturbing revelations, and their reason for refusing to serve him has left the public speechless. What seemed like a quiet resignation has now turned into a scandal filled with whispered allegations, secret encounters, and royal cover-ups. Could this finally expose what's been hidden behind palace doors for years? Today we uncover the real reason these royal maids walked away from Prince Andrew. The chaos inside the royal lodge. It wasn't just a resignation. It was an exodus from a mansion that once symbolized privilege. The royal lodge, nestled in Windsor Great Park, had for centuries stood as a quiet emblem of royal grace and family heritage. Built in the 17th century and once the cherished home of the Queen Mother, its sprawling gardens and ivy-wrapped walls had witnessed countless royal gatherings and moments of charm. But by the time Prince Andrew took residence after her passing in 2002, the elegance that defined the estate began to clash with an entirely different kind of atmosphere, one of tension, exhaustion, and discontent. For years, the Royal Lodge had promised staff a career surrounded by history and prestige. Many maids described their excitement upon first arrival. Polished corridors, manicured lawns, and the subtle scent of roses from the Queen Mother's old garden. But that initial awe quickly turned into anxiety. Long hours stretched into nights, and tasks multiplied without notice. According to several insiders, maids were expected to work 12 to 16 hours a day, often without proper breaks. Some even claimed their wages didn't match the workload, with overtime dismissed as part of royal service. The first wave of resignations reportedly began quietly, one maid handing in notice after being denied a weekend off for her mother's funeral, another walking away after being publicly scolded for missing a speck of dust on a windowsill. Yet within weeks, it turned into a pattern. What started as isolated frustrations became a full-blown staff exodus. By the end of the season, nearly an entire team of domestic staff had left, leaving corridors unpolished and silverware untended. It wasn't rebellion. It was exhaustion disguised as resignation. Behind the grand facade, complaints piled up. Staff spoke of toxic routines, endless duties with no clear boundaries, and a management culture that dismissed fatigue as weakness. Rules were rigid and old-fashioned. Uniforms had to be pressed twice daily. Certain hallways could only be crossed when the Duke wasn't around, and even the smallest error could lead to humiliation. Requests for time off were often denied, and the promise of royal stability turned into a cycle of overwork and fear. Yet, the irony was impossible to ignore. The very estate that once hosted royal tea parties and garden luncheons had become a house haunted by silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the kind born from people too afraid to speak. The Royal Lodge, steeped in history and privilege, now found itself rich in heritage, but poor in humanity. Those who left said it wasn't a single moment that broke them, but the slow unraveling of respect. Managers stopped listening. Grievances were brushed aside, and the prestige of serving royalty lost its shine. Some staff recalled that the moment they realized they were replaceable, not respected, was the moment they decided to walk away. And as they did, the Royal Lodge, once a symbol of royal continuity, began to feel emptier than ever. The gold-frame portraits still hung on the walls. The chandeliers still glittered in evening light, but the heartbeat of the house, The people who kept it alive had quietly vanished into the night. But what truly drives loyalty to vanish? Exhaustion or humiliation? Keep watching, because the answer goes far beyond money. More than pay, it was the atmosphere. The maids often said it wasn't about money. It was about respect. Inside the gates of the Royal Lodge, where history clings to every wall, the atmosphere had grown thick with unease. What was once considered an honor to serve in the Duke of York's, residence began to feel more like a sentence. The uniforms were crisp, the etiquette strict, and the expectations endless. But it wasn't the work that broke people. It was the treatment that came with it. Many former staff members spoke of an environment that seemed built on quiet intimidation. Supervisors barked orders rather than gave instructions. Every movement was watched, every gesture noted. Some staff claimed they were reprimanded for the smallest details. A slightly uneven curtain, a misplaced teaspoon, a delay of seconds in answering a call. Even the tone of one's good morning could draw disapproval if it didn't sound sufficiently formal. The surveillance was constant, both physical and psychological. Cameras watched corridors. Supervisors lingered silently, and the weight of perfection pressed down on everyone. For maids working behind those ornate doors, there was little room for error and even less room for emotion. Tears, if shed, were to be hidden. Several accounts described workers crying quietly in the linen closets or bathroom stalls, never from laziness or incompetence, but from sheer exhaustion and humiliation. And if they dared to complain, there were ways to silence them. New contracts came with strict non-dis, closure agreements, making sure no one spoke to the press or shared details of internal affairs. Some said they signed these documents without understanding the full legal implications, too afraid to ask questions or risk losing their positions. But the strain wasn't just coming from the inside. Outside the lodge, Prince Andrew's public scandals had become an inescapable shadow. The controversy surrounding his associations and the eventual loss of his royal titles created an atmosphere of tension that seeped into daily life. Staff were told to maintain dignified silence whenever his name appeared in the headlines, but the gossip in the corridors was impossible to contain. Every new development brought tighter rules, more secrecy, and heightened anxiety. Some workers feared being questioned by the media or even associated with the Duke's name publicly. For many, the job that once promised stability now carried a quiet shame. As months passed, the weight of these pressures broke whatever loyalty remained. Maids began leaving not because of low pay, but because of the emotional toll. Some simply stopped showing up. Others handed in short, nervous resignation letters that said more between the lines than the words themselves. The housekeepers left in waves, describing their time there as degrading, unnatural, and spirit-crushing. The Royal Lodge, with all its grandeur, could no longer disguise the cracks forming beneath its polished surface. It was a place where even the most dedicated staff lost their sense of worth. As one former maid quietly said, when even royal wages can't buy loyalty, something deeper is broken. And in that single sentence, she summed up what years of silence had been trying to say all along: that no amount of gold, history, or prestige could cover the simple truth that respect, once lost, can never be restored. But what happens when a royal scandal meets rules frozen in time? Stay tuned to find out. Rules from another era and a fallen prince. By the time the last of the senior maids walked out, the Royal Lodge was no longer just a stressful workplace. It had become a museum of outdated traditions. The tension that had been quietly building from the scandals and staff resignations in the previous months was now made worse by the strange old-fashioned rules that refused to die. Many staff described it as living in a time capsule where every day felt like reenacting royal life from a century ago, only without the grace that once defined it. Inside those ornate halls, the expectations bordered on absurd. Maids were reportedly required to curtsy to empty rooms before beginning their cleaning routines, a ritual meant to show respect to the unseen presence of royalty. Floors had to be scrubbed by hand, no matter the size of the corridor, and vacuum cleaners were discouraged because the noise was considered unbecoming of royal calm. Curtains had to be drawn at specific angles, bed sheets folded into precise military corners, and fires in the hearth arranged so perfectly that even a misplaced ember could spark a reprimand. Work began before sunrise and often stretched deep into the night. Some staff claimed they barely had time to eat, and when they did, meals were taken hurriedly out of sight. The work itself wasn't what made it unbearable. It was the unrelenting scrutiny that followed every move. There was a constant fear of being watched, judged, or corrected, as if the rules themselves held more importance than the people who followed them. But things shifted dramatically after Prince Andrew lost his royal titles and military roles in early 2022, following his public controversies. The decision announced by Buckingham Palace formally ended his duties as His Royal Highness, stripping him of privileges he had held for decades. For those inside the Royal Lodge, this moment was seismic. Overnight, the tone of the household changed. The aura of command gave way to defensiveness, and silence hung heavier in the air. Without his official status, Andrew's residence felt like a royal household without its crown. The staff no longer referred to him with his full title, yet they were still expected to observe the same rigid hierarchy. It created a strange kind of confusion. The maids were caught between serving a prince who was no longer fully royal and maintaining customs that now felt hollow. One staffer reportedly described the atmosphere as working in a kingdom that no longer exists. As public scrutiny around the Duke intensified, so did the pressure inside. Management grew stricter, almost desperate to preserve an image of order, even as morale crumbled. The once respectful tone of the household had hardened into something else entirely. Fear-driven obedience, conversations grew quieter, laughter disappeared, and every task felt like a test of loyalty rather than service. The emotional contrast was striking. The Duke stripped of titles, the maids stripped of dignity. Both sides were losing something they once believed untouchable. Status on one end, self-respect on the other. What had once been a place of royal continuity now felt like a stage play with no audience where everyone kept performing a role they no longer believed in. The Royal Lodge had become a paradox, grand, historic, and meticulously maintained, yet hollowed out by the very traditions it tried to protect. And beneath the polished silver and royal portraits, a quiet truth settled in the hearts of those who remained. The crown might survive scandal, but its glow no longer reached the servants who bore its weight. But what happens when loyalty can no longer pay the bills? Stick around, the cracks are about to show. Fair pay versus royal privilege. By the time Prince Andrew's titles were gone, and the mood inside the Royal Lodge had grown unbearably tense, another truth began to surface. One that had less to do with scandal and more to do with simple arithmetic. The maids, who polished chandeliers worth thousands, earned barely enough to afford rent outside the palace gates. Their paychecks didn't match the palace address, and everyone in the household knew it. When new staff were recruited, they were promised a royal experience, a phrase that implied prestige, stability, and lifelong pride. But within weeks, many realized they had signed up for royal exhaustion. The hours were long, the wages modest, and the workload unending. While guests admired the lodge's lavish renovations, new draperies, restored antiques, fresh landscaping, those who made it all possible returned to shared staff quarters that hadn't seen an upgrade in decades. Public records showed that the Royal Lodge had undergone expensive refurbishments after the Queen Mother's passing, and again in later years when Prince Andrew sought to maintain its grandeur. The exterior may have gleamed with fresh paint and manicured lawns, but inside wages remained stagnant. Some maids quietly calculated that they were earning less per hour than casual hotel workers despite serving one of the highest-ranking members of the royal family. The imbalance was obvious, and it stung deeply. Whispers about royal spending didn't help either. News reports of lavish private expenses and taxpayer contributions to property maintenance began circulating, sparking public debate. Many of those still working within the lodge read those headlines with mixed feelings, loyalty battling resentment. They were expected to uphold the family's image, yet they couldn't escape the growing sense that the very system they were protecting had forgotten them. One staff member reportedly said, "We keep the royal image spotless while our own lives fall apart." It wasn't bitterness as much as heartbreak, a quiet realization that the values they once admired had become empty rituals. As critics outside questioned how public money was used, those inside wondered something else entirely. Could the funds spent preserving image have fixed the cracks in its foundation? The people who kept it running? The answer was as clear as the polished silverware. Appearances had taken precedence over people, and within those walls, the maids learned that grandeur without gratitude always comes at a cost, one that no paycheck could ever balance. But how long can a palace built on silence keep its walls from talking? Stay tuned, the truth is about to leak out. Leaked secrets and political pressure. Whispers that once stayed hidden within the Royal Lodge eventually slipped through the cracks. And when they did, the palace walls could no longer contain them. What had begun as quiet grumbling among exhausted maids turned into a series of leaks and anonymous memoir fragments that exposed the inner workings of Prince Andrew's household. Each new revelation pulled back another layer of royal secrecy, painting a picture of overwork, silence, and fear that the Duke's aides could no longer dismiss as gossip. Some of the leaked stories were brief but damning. Snapshots of tears behind closed doors, staff reprimanded for the smallest mistakes, and the suffocating routines that ruled daily life at the lodge. Others were more detailed, reportedly taken from private notes or conversations among former staff. They described an environment where dignity had been replaced by duty, and where loyalty was demanded but never reciprocated. It wasn't long before these fragments reached reporters, and soon the lodge's polished image began to tarnish under the glare of public scrutiny. The leaks triggered something even bigger, a political reaction. Members of Parliament began raising questions about the Royal Lodge itself. How could a nun, working royal, stripped of official duties, still occupy one of the grandest residences in Windsor at the expense of taxpayers? Headlines soon echoed those sentiments, demanding accountability. MP called for Prince Andrew to vacate the estate, insisting it was inappropriate for him to continue living there while the monarchy publicly distanced itself from his controversies. For the remaining staff, this was the breaking point. Their once private workplace had become a stage for national debate. Every day felt heavier, the atmosphere tighter. Some feared their conversations were being monitored for further leaks. Others dreaded running into photographers stationed near the gates. The sense of security, already fragile, completely evaporated. Even those who had stayed out of loyalty, now began to reconsider whether it was worth enduring the pressure. The Royal Lodge, once a sanctuary of heritage and prestige, had turned into a spotlight no one wanted to stand under. For the staff still scrubbing its gilded halls, the irony was bitter. They were tasked with keeping the palace spotless, while the headlines kept staining it. And in that unending battle between image and truth, it became painfully clear. No matter how carefully they polished the mirrors, the reflections staring back at them would never shine the same way again. So, what happens when the secrets you're paid to protect start spilling faster than you can clean them up? Keep watching stories that broke the silence. As leaks and political pressure intensified, more former staff found the courage to speak, and their stories revealed what no official statement ever could. They weren't tales of rebellion or scandal. They were small, painfully human moments that exposed just how deep the cracks inside the Royal Lodge had run. One maid recalled being punished for overhearing a private conversation while dusting the hallway outside a sitting room. She hadn't said a word to anyone, yet somehow the next morning she was reassigned to laundry duty, a demotion in the strict hierarchy of palace service. The message was clear. Silence wasn't just expected, it was enforced. Another maid described being forced to redo an entire suite, simply because a curtain fold wasn't perfectly aligned. She worked through her lunch break, finishing long after dark, only to receive a scolding for moving too slowly. "You start believing you're invisible," she reportedly said later, "except when you make a mistake." But the story that spread fastest through the staff quarters was about a young maid denied emergency leave to attend her father's funeral. The decision came from a supervisor who claimed the household was too short-staffed to allow her absence. That night, she quietly packed her uniform, left her keys on the dresser, and walked out the side gate. Within a week, 2 more maids followed her lead. It was the beginning of the mass resignations that turned private frustration into a public exodus. These moments may seem small, but together they painted a portrait of a workplace where fear outweighed fairness. For many, it wasn't the long hours or strict rules that broke them. It was the feeling that compassion had been scrubbed out along with the dust. Meanwhile, Prince Andrew's image continued to unravel outside those walls. The release of Andrew Looney's unauthorized biography, The Duke of York, the rise and fall of the House of York, reignited public debate. The book delved into his personal controversies and portrayed him as increasingly isolated and defensive, an image that eerily mirrored the mood inside the Royal Lodge. For staff still working there, it was another blow to morale, a confirmation that their household had become a symbol of decline rather than distinction. And so, as the Duke's reputation dimmed in the public eye, his household faded with it, not with drama or rebellion, but through quiet departures, whispered stories, and the silence of those who had finally had enough. But here's the question: could one man's fall have doomed an entire household? Stay tuned to find out. Did Prince Andrew really drive them away? The quiet that followed the staff departures didn't feel peaceful. It felt unresolved within the Royal Lodge. The question no one wanted to voice hung in the air like dust after a storm. Was this downfall caused by Prince Andrew himself, or had the system around him collapsed under its own weight? The accounts left behind suggest something far more complicated than simple blame. Many of those who walked away never accused the Duke directly of mistreatment. Instead, they described an environment so tightly controlled that humanity seemed to vanish beneath the rules. They spoke of supervisors enforcing silence, of traditions that valued image over empathy, and of a workplace running on fear rather than leadership. Yet Andrew's personal decline undeniably deepened that tension. Once his royal titles were stripped in 2022 and his public standing fell apart, the household's tone changed completely. The Royal Lodge was no longer a proud residence of a working royal. It became a fortress of discomfort. Staff worked under constant scrutiny from outside and uncertainty from within. The Duke's presence grew quieter, more distant, while management seemed increasingly desperate to maintain order and appearances. You could feel the strain in everything, one insider noted. Every instruction felt heavier, every rule stricter. No one wanted to be noticed, not even him. Prince Andrew's loss of privilege mirrored the decline of the home he occupied. The grandeur remained, but the spirit drained away. Without clear leadership or purpose, the lodge became a symbol of what happens when structure outweighs compassion. Some of the harsh policies, strict silence, relentless cleaning protocols, and punishment for small mistakes were remnants of royal tradition. But under pressure, they hardened into something toxic. So, did Prince Andrew truly drive them away? Perhaps not directly. Yet, his fall from grace exposed how fragile loyalty can be when power fades and respect disappears. The Royal Lodge became more than just a residence. It became a reflection of its master's isolation, immaculate on the outside, empty within. The maids may have left quietly, but their silence remains the loudest voice in that house. In the hush of those gilded rooms, one truth lingers. Even palaces can lose their splendor when dignity is no longer part of the service. So, what do you think truly pushed the maids to walk away? The scandals, the pressure, or the loss of respect? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.